Elliot Grayson was the kind of man you'd forget after a single encounter: polite, quiet, and utterly unremarkable. Emma Crawford, on the other hand, was unforgettable: bright, ambitious, and full of life. Yet, their paths crossed in a way that would leave one buried beneath a vibrant garden, and the other exposed as the most chilling predator Maplebrook had ever known. Maplebrook, a quaint and idyllic town in the heart of Vermont, was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time. The streets were lined with charming houses, each with neatly trimmed lawns and blooming flower beds that seemed to compete for the title of best in town. On weekends, families gathered at the local park for picnics, and children rode their bikes through tree-lined streets, their laughter echoing in the crisp mountain air. Life in Maplebrook was predictable, safe, and, to many, perfect. But beneath its postcard-perfect exterior, the town harbored a mystery that would forever tarnish its peaceful image. Among the townsfolk, there was one resident who stood out, not for his charm or warmth, but for his quiet, almost ghostly presence. Elliot Grayson, a man in his mid-50s, lived alone in a modest ivy-covered cottage on the outskirts of town. His house, tucked away at the end of a gravel path, was surrounded by a lush garden that seemed almost otherworldly in its beauty. Vibrant roses climbed trellises, exotic plants thrived in neat rows, and vegetables grew in abundance, their colors vivid against the dark, rich soil. It was said that Eliot's garden could rival the botanical displays of professional horticulturists, and many in the town wondered how one man could maintain such perfection. Despite the admiration for his garden, Eliot himself remained an enigma. He was rarely seen in town and even less often heard. When he did venture out, it was to run brief errands at the general store or to buy seeds and tools for his garden. He spoke politely but sparingly, never lingering for small talk. Those who encountered him described him as polite but distant, a man who seemed to carry an invisible barrier between himself and the rest of the world. In a town where everyone knew everyone, Eliot's reclusive nature became a topic of speculation. Some dismissed him as a harmless introvert, content with his own company. Others wove fantastical stories about his past, imagining heartbreak or tragedy that had driven him to seek solace in the soil. Still, no one had any real reason to suspect him of anything sinister. After all, he paid his taxes, kept his property immaculate, and never caused trouble. If anything, his presence was almost too unobtrusive, as if he made an effort to blend into the background of Maplebrook's daily life. Yet, there was something about Eliot's house that felt unsettling, even to those who admired his gardening skills. Children dared each other to run up to his porch on Halloween, but they would always sprint away before knocking, giggling nervously. A few neighbors noticed that Eliot's lights stayed on late into the night, casting eerie shadows on the walls of his home. But these were dismissed as quirks, the harmless habits of a man who preferred plants to people. Life in Maplebrook carried on as it always had, the rhythm of the seasons dictating the town's pace. But unknown to anyone, a storm was brewing beneath the surface, a storm that would shatter the illusion of peace and reveal the unthinkable. While the flowers in Eliot's garden bloomed in vibrant colors, secrets darker than anyone could imagine lay buried beneath the soil, waiting to be uncovered. The tranquility of Maplebrook was shattered on a warm summer evening when 17-year-old Emma Crawford disappeared. Emma was a well-known and well-loved member of the community, a bright, athletic teenager with a radiant smile and big plans for her future. She often ran along the wooded trails near the outskirts of town, a routine that many knew well. When she didn't return home that night, her family assumed she had lost track of time, but as hours passed and calls to her phone went unanswered, concern gave way to panic. The search for Emma began immediately. Dozens of volunteers from the town joined local authorities, scouring the trails and surrounding forest with flashlights and determined hearts. The woods were dense, with towering trees and thick underbrush that made the search slow and arduous. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf sent waves of hope through the searchers, only to be replaced by dread as the hours dragged on. By dawn, there was still no trace of Emma. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Flyers with Emma's smiling face were plastered on telephone poles and shop windows. Her disappearance was the talk of the town, with residents speculating about every possible scenario. Some suggested she might have run away, but those who knew Emma dismissed the idea immediately. She was close to her family, excited about her upcoming college plans, and had no history of rebellion or trouble. Others feared she had been abducted, a chilling possibility that brought an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability to the usually safe town. The police combed through Emma's digital footprint, questioned her friends and family, and even brought in tracking dogs to follow her scent. The dogs led searchers to a wooded area near the edge of town, but stopped abruptly near a small clearing. The clearing was less than a mile from the property of Elliot Grayson, the reclusive gardener whose home had long been a fixture of curiosity in Maplebrook. At first, the connection to Elliot's property seemed coincidental. The area was popular with joggers and hikers, and Emma wasn't the first person to pass near his land. But as the days stretched into weeks with no progress, some began to wonder if Elliot's proximity to the trail might warrant a closer look. It was a retired police officer, Tom Ridley, who first noticed something unusual on one of his own walks near the property. He had taken his dog out for a morning stroll when he spotted a patch of soil that seemed out of place in Elliot's otherwise meticulously kept garden. The soil was freshly turned, slightly raised, and bordered by a haphazard arrangement of stones, so unlike the symmetry and order Elliot was known for. Ridley's instincts told him something wasn't right. He reported his findings to the authorities, urging them to investigate. At first, there was hesitation. Elliot had no known criminal history, and his reputation, though distant, was spotless. But with no other leads, the police obtained a warrant to search the property. When they arrived at Elliot's home, the peaceful facade of Maplebrook began to crack. Officers moved through the garden, their boots sinking into the rich, dark soil that had long been a source of admiration in the town. They dug carefully, their shovels slicing through the earth, and soon the serene beauty of the garden gave way to a grim and horrifying discovery. The peaceful beauty of Elliot Grayson's garden was irreparably shattered when police unearthed what lay beneath its vibrant surface. The first discovery was horrifying enough, a shallow grave containing human remains wrapped in decaying fabric. Forensic investigators swarmed the property, carefully sectioning off areas and methodically searching the soil. Each new find deepened the sense of dread. Over the next several hours, they uncovered not one but 6 graves scattered throughout the garden. News of the discovery spread through Maplebrook like wildfire. The quiet town, once known for its postcard charm, was now the center of a gruesome investigation. Reporters descended on the area, their cameras capturing the surreal juxtaposition of colorful flowers swaying gently in the breeze above the disturbed ground. Residents who had once admired Elliot's gardening skills now looked at his property with a mix of horror and betrayal. The police worked tirelessly to identify the remains. The first confirmed victim was Emma Crawford, the missing teenager whose disappearance had set this chain of events in motion. Her family, who had held on to a sliver of hope, was devastated by the confirmation of her fate. The other victims, however, presented a puzzle. They were older, some buried for years, their identities a mystery. Forensic evidence suggested they had been killed over a span of 2 decades, indicating that Elliot's crimes were not a recent development, but part of a long, hidden pattern. Elliot himself was arrested at his home without incident. He offered no resistance, his expression eerily calm as police led him away in handcuffs. When questioned, he neither confessed nor denied the allegations, instead maintaining an unnerving silence. His lack of reaction only added to the growing unease among investigators. How could someone live among the dead for so long without any outward sign of guilt or remorse? As detectives combed through Elliot's home, they found further evidence that painted a chilling picture. A collection of personal items belonging to the victims was discovered in a locked room. A bracelet, a notebook, a faded photograph. Each item seemed to represent a life taken, a trophy of his dark deeds. The meticulous records of his gardening, dates, planting schedules, and soil conditions now took on a sinister meaning. Investigators theorized that Elliot had chosen specific plants to mark each grave, creating a grotesque memorial to his victims. The people of Maplebrook were stunned. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? Elliot had lived among them for years, his garden admired by many, yet no one had suspected a thing. Neighbors who had once dismissed his reclusiveness as harmless now questioned every interaction they'd ever had with him. Parents pulled their children closer, uneasy at the realization that a predator had lived in their midst. The case took a toll on the town, its once strong sense of safety replaced by paranoia and grief. Forensic teams continued their work on Elliot's property, knowing there might be more to uncover. Meanwhile, the question loomed, why? What had driven this quiet man to commit such monstrous acts, and how many more secrets might he be hiding beneath the surface? As the investigation into Elliot Grayson's crimes deepened, the focus shifted from the horrifying discoveries in his garden to his shadowy past. The man who had seemed like an unremarkable recluse was revealed to have a history far more complex and disturbing than anyone in Maplebrook could have imagined. Elliot had lived in Maplebrook for nearly a decade, but his life before that was a patchwork of short stays in various small towns across the northeastern United States. He had no close friends, no family who kept in touch, and no significant records to provide insight into his personal life. Investigators dug into his background and found evidence of a carefully constructed facade. His real name wasn't even Elliot Grayson. It was Peter Malone, a name tied to unsolved disappearances in 3 different states. In each place Elliot had lived, the pattern was eerily similar. He worked simple jobs, landscaping, maintenance, or odd tasks that kept him under the radar. He always chose jobs that involved working alone, and he moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to form meaningful relationships. It was as if he had spent his life perfecting the art of being invisible. What was particularly chilling were the connections to past cases. In one town, a hitchhiker was last seen near a park where Elliot had worked as a groundskeeper. In another, a drifter had disappeared after being spotted near a community garden he helped maintain. None of these cases had enough evidence to point to a suspect at the time, but looking back, they all bore the hallmarks of Elliot's methodical approach. The FBI became involved, expanding the investigation to a national level. They theorized that Elliot had preyed on the vulnerable, transient individuals, runaways, and those on the fringes of society. These were people who could disappear without causing much alarm, their lives marked by instability and few close ties. This made them the perfect targets for someone who thrived on operating in the shadows. What baffled investigators most was Elliot's apparent lack of a clear motive. There was no evidence of financial gain, no sign of personal vendettas, and no indication that he had suffered traumatic events that might explain his actions. Psychologists brought in to analyze his behavior suggested that his crimes might have been about control, a need to assert dominance over others in the most extreme way possible. Further searches of Elliot's home uncovered meticulously kept journals, though their content was more cryptic than revealing. The entries were a mix of gardening notes, musings on nature, and fragmented thoughts that hinted at a detached, almost philosophical view of life and death. One passage stood out. The soil nourishes all things. In death, there is life. In decay, beauty. Investigators couldn't determine whether this was an expression of guilt, justification, or something else entirely. The revelation of Elliot's dark past sent shockwaves through Maplebrook and beyond. The townspeople struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet gardener with that of a predator who had left a trail of destruction spanning decades. Families of the victims from other states began to come forward, hoping for closure, but dreading the confirmation of their worst fears. Elliot's true nature was finally coming into focus, but the full extent of his crimes and the reasons behind them remained a chilling mystery. Elliot Grayson's trial drew national attention, turning the once quiet town of Maplebrook into a hub of media frenzy. News vans lined the streets, and reporters scrambled to cover every development. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and grieving families, all eager to uncover the truth about the man whose actions had left so many lives shattered. Yet even as the trial began, Elliot remained as enigmatic as ever. The prosecution presented a damning case. The physical evidence alone, human remains found on Elliot's property, personal items belonging to the victims, and his journals, was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified that the bodies were buried with care, each one meticulously placed beneath a specific plant. The prosecution argued that this wasn't the work of a man in the throes of impulsive violence, but rather a calculated killer who took great care to conceal his crimes. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence was the timeline of Elliott's movements over the past 2 decades. Using old employment records, receipts, and witness statements, investigators linked him to numerous unsolved disappearances across several states. While they couldn't prove his involvement in every case, the similarities were striking. Elliott had always chosen isolated locations, targeting individuals who could vanish without much notice. But the defense took an unexpected approach. They claimed that Elliott suffered from severe dissociative identity disorder, DID, asserting that the killings were committed by an alternate personality of which he had no awareness. The defense brought in psychologists who testified that Elliott displayed signs of deep psychological trauma, possibly stemming from abuse in his childhood. They argued that he was not fully responsible for his actions because he was unaware of them at the time they occurred. The revelation of Elliott's supposed mental illness divided the courtroom and the public. Some saw it as a desperate attempt to escape justice, while others wondered if there could be a kernel of truth in the claim. Questions swirled. Could a man who appeared so composed and methodical truly be unaware of his actions? Or was he using a fabricated diagnosis to manipulate the system? The jury was faced with a harrowing decision. After weeks of testimony, they found Elliott guilty of multiple counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that brought some measure of relief to the victims' families. Yet, even with the verdict, many felt that justice was incomplete. There were still unanswered questions, still lingering doubts about how many more lives Elliott might have taken and why he had chosen to kill in the first place. Months after his incarceration, the case took another grim turn. Authorities in another state discovered a body buried in a wooded area where Elliott had briefly lived years earlier. The victim's death matched the same pattern as those found in Maplebrook, suggesting there could be more victims yet to be uncovered. Elliott refused to cooperate with investigators, maintaining his silence even as new evidence emerged. His calm, unreadable demeanor only deepened the mystery surrounding him. The people of Maplebrook, once a close-knit and trusting community, were left to grapple with the knowledge that a killer had walked among them for years, hidden in plain sight. Though Elliott would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the case haunted all who had been touched by it. The garden that had once been a source of admiration and beauty was razed, replaced by an unmarked patch of earth, a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken root there. Even as life in Maplebrook tried to return to normal, the shadow of Elliott Grayson lingered, a chilling testament to the darkness that can hide behind the most unassuming of facades.